came through in the data a bit before that shopping is good for you. It's going to make your moshi monster happy. You should probably do it. So ultimately, it's the child themselves that is the consumer, because they're the target of lots of ads. Ads like these. These are some that we observed in one session. This is when we were not playing as members. We got served far more of these kinds of ads that point to the limitations of a non-member account and then provide a useful link that will allow you to part with your money very quickly. So ultimately the players are the ones who are positioned as consumers and customers of the virtual world itself. And so non-members are served these ads, and in one 37-minute session we saw 6 ads, so that's roughly one every 6 minutes. It's quite relentless. The ads are always related to things in the online virtual world. Another thing that seemed important to address relates to the kind of common concerns that parents have about these sorts of online virtual worlds. It's important that children learn to interact online by critically creating texts. So in essence, children need to learn how you manage information about yourself, what kind of information should you make available, and what kind of information should you not make available. So it's pretty clear that parents have a role to play here, because these are activities that are generally going on outside of school. But one question that's raised is to what extent the school should also be involved in providing these kinds of digital literacies. Schools now typically make use of various kinds of e-learning environments, and so questions like these and other questions about online etiquette or online security, for example the construction of appropriate usernames and passwords, all seem to be relevant topics for this kind of age group. So I just want to conclude now by saying that it's studies like this one which can provide the kind of empirical foundation upon which to build a kind of critical pedagogy for digital literacies. Because children are increasingly exposed to these sorts of digital practices at younger and younger ages, we have to think about ways to develop age-appropriate strategies that will raise awareness of the kind of discursive potentials and pitfalls of digital practices like participation in online virtual worlds. Thank you.
I'm just going to find Chris, maybe, to see about the Skype. So I don't know whether we can... Oh, okay, brilliant. We can begin with some questions. But I was going to see what a lot of people have changed the temperature.
Just turn it on.
So that might be So hopefully in terms of microphones, this should be the one that goes with the Skype, and then these will be ones that we can pass around for questions. Hopefully, Jackie should be able to keep us that one.
So they're constantly asking
It's interesting because when they said, can we be members, we said, yeah, but you're paying.
You saw a research person. I know you didn't.
We made them pay.
She should have given us a research grant.
Oh, right. That's in the works. Yeah, right.
So you said they had to pay out of campaign.
Over here they get Lycée, and Chinese New Year, everybody gives some money. And so, yeah, we see. $5 a month or something like that. Yeah. Interestingly, now they've moved on to Minecraft. Yeah. So they were lukewarm about the study, and then the minute we finished, they were saying, "Dad, let's go play Minecraft, shall we?" And so I'm now learning that.
So how much are they spending? Much more than $5 a month?
No. It's a subscription fee that.
Oh, you don't, and just either exchange money or
that's right.
it's in the local
That's right.
currency.
No, it's $5 US a month.
And that's it.
And that's it.
You don't spend any more money you buy it or
I guess that there's probably ads try to sell you that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But they didn't respond to those. It'd actually be interesting to look at how children do respond to ads. And
That's for sure.
what I noticed was that,
That's why I try to get money for it.
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I found that my kids were just clicking them away and not reading them most of the time. But
And you
I
could
think
do that
that's-
easily.
It was easy to do that.
Yeah. But sometimes on sites it's really bad.
Yeah.
I don't really get ads.
Right, right. These are actually like they fill up the whole screen, and then there's a cross in the corner.
Yeah.
So, as a non-member, you can't access every single part of the website. Whenever you try to go somewhere, like for example, Gift Island, if you want to send a gift, you go to Gift Island. But if you try to go there and you're a non-member, then a big ad appears encouraging you to, only members can go to Gift Island, but people join that type thing.
Did you have to pay for your hedgehog?
Oh, but he's going to see what she sees.
No, so not real money.
Labour.
No.
Yes,
What about the labour?
Labour.
The labor, yeah, hours and hours.
So you didn't actually spend any money? Nothing?
Hi, Jackie.
Hi, I can see you.
Oh,
Can you see me?
No, we cannot see you.
You can see a picture, but
Oh, just
or is it?
okay.
It might be a totally frozen video.
Hang on, let's have a look.
Here we are.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
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 Hi. So we've just finished Christoph's talk. So there's a small interim while people have just gone to the bathrooms, I think. So they're coming back. So we just want to check that your ankle is able to work and that you can hear us. So welcome. We'll do that for you when people come back.
Hi, Jackie.
Hi.
Hi, Jackie.
Go say
If this
hello.
doesn't work at all, if it interrupts the flow.
No, it works. I think everybody needs to have a very quick bathroom break.
Yeah.
Mm.
No, it's great. It's perfect, actually, isn't it?
Yes, fine. Works fine, Jackie.
Yeah, I can't hear you that well, but I'll
Yeah.
I bet.
Well,
I'll
you're
sit a bit
yeah.
closer. Usually you have some horrible faces this time of morning.
Hi.
Yeah. Good
Hi,
morning.
hi Jackie. Is that better?
Where's the camera?
I'm a lot better.
There.
I'm
Yeah.
just so glad that I got that second presentation to you because the first one was crazy. It was croaking and, insisted on reading every single bullet point.
No, it worked. It was quite.
So please that wasn't inflicted on the group.
It was quite coherent. And can you hear clearly with the microphone now?
Is what, sorry?
Can you hear clearly now? The microphone's on.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah. Where the bin men are outside, the bin refuse collectors are outside.
Okay.
So I'll do my best. You know how noisy they all are.
Just tell them to be quiet. That's why you pay rates.
So what time is it there?
It is 3 o'clock. It's just 10 to 3 in the afternoon.
Okay.
So is it 8 o'clock in the morning? Is it?
Hi, Jackie. Oh, wow. It's really loud. Hi, Jackie. Hi. I'm Rodney. I'm the acting head of department here at City University. Thanks very much for joining us on this Skype conversation. As we were setting up, people thought, okay, we're taking a break now. So about half the people have escaped from the room, but they should be filtering back in just a second. But I want to say how much I enjoyed your presentation. Actually, the only other presentation I've seen by you was a presentation that you gave on, I think it was Second Life or something like that. You were in some kind of virtual, you were a virtual avatar. And so it's very, very interesting to see your non-avatared body on the screen, I must say. So I'm going to hand this over to the moderator of this session, Tracy, and she's going to field some questions.
I am, yes. Hello. Hello. I feel like I'm an X-Factor and I didn't think you could see me. Hello. Sort of disembodied voice. So hopefully what we're going to do is sort of field questions for both you and Christoph, whose presentation came after yours. But before we do that, I just wanted to kind of thank you and welcome you to the same way that we've done with everybody else. So thank you for coming with us today.
You don't get the food though, that's one of the disadvantages.
I know. I'm so upset, but never mind.
So I'm just going to move out of the ways to see people. So if you hear my voice from the side, I do apologise. Any questions so far from people either for Christoph or for Jackie? Don't be shy.
I have a question. Actually, this is a question that Christoph brought up, and it's something that you also touched upon in your presentation, at least in kind of problematizing the whole commercialization of online worlds for children. And the question that Christoph asked is, well, what do we do about this in terms of helping young people? And here we're talking about very, very young people in developing critical literacies, or even actually helping their parents develop critical literacies around these kinds of practices. And what does that mean? I mean, does that mean turning them into sort of primary school Norman Faircloths, or does it mean something else? So in your view, what is the next step? How do we respond to sort of the Disneyfication of our children's minds?
Does Christoph want to go first, or shall I?
Seeing as you've got the Skype, why don't we hear from you first?
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I didn't hear the phrase that you used about what we might turn children into, but I think it's a really important point. How do we do it in ways which don't dismiss and ignore the pleasure that children get through their commercial practices? Because inevitably, it brings a range of pleasurable things to them. So I think that often criticality is developed through the productive process. So we've not done this. We did try to create some machinima in the classroom that I talked about, but because of the firewall we weren't able to. But one of the plans there was to engage the children in a production around a virtual world that would involve analysis of Disney and its emporium and what Disney and the strategies that Disney were doing. So the children would have to do that analysis before they then tried to construct something themselves. Which gave them an insight into how virtual currency worked and how that related to currency outside of school. So for me, it'd be very much sort of embedded within practical activities within the curriculum from an early age. And it is, all of the work of Vivian Vasquez shows that it's really easy to engage children in, age 3, 4 in that kind of critical thinking. And I've worked with teachers previously in kindergartens and nurseries where they've done critical thinking around things like media and portrayal of princesses in the media and they're always white, rich, etc., etc. So it would be, I think, quite easy to develop strategies around, especially, if we look at Disney and Moshi Monsters, which is even a more extreme example, I would say. I don't know what Christoph thinks, but at least at Disney don't have the in-world advertising, whatever that means. Actually, I think there is in-world advertising in quite subtle ways. So some of the characters that you see in the world of Club Penguin, those characters are then portrayed in the magazines, in the tweets, Facebook, and so on. So there is that sort of subtle in-world marketing. But as far as I can see with the Moshi Monsters, it's just, way out exploitation of, it appears to be anyway, the strategies that they use. So I would think it would be quite easy to, get children to begin to unpick some of that. I'll invite Christoph to respond to that.
I was one of my questions really is how do we go about it? I think it's important to address the issues and try to get children, as you say, to unpick things like the ads and that sort of thing. I'm not too sure how one does that with that age group, but what I would like to see really, and which I didn't see very much of in the small amount of data that I had, was more examples of the sort of children taking control and asserting their agency, something that you mentioned in your talk as well. You know, I was interested by that. What was the, was it, I think, FU Disney or something like that? The video that was created, kind of subversive video, and I'd like to see whether there are opportunities for the children to make those kinds of statements. Whether, you know, just perhaps that they have the full range of options open to, they're not just being channeled in one single direction. So that's my comment.
So Neil and then back to Bill. Sorry.
So is the school the place to be doing it?
Mm.
So are we looking to offline contexts? Not that there is perhaps a difference. We've established that already, that they're kind of blurring these things. It's all to go to a formal education context. Are there informal and perhaps online contexts where we can do that? Or is that missing the point? I'm interested that we're going back to the schools solution.
Again, I think that's another interesting question. I would say that it is really important for that to happen in school as well as in formal spaces. Just because some children don't get those opportunities within formal spaces to practice some of those skills and to enhance their... This is not to sort of suggest that children enter schools as blank slates, you know, with no critical faculties whatsoever. They, from a very early age, they become very critical, I think, of their online platforms and, you know, are able to discern what the affordances of those and what might be best for them and so on. But no, you know, as we know, some children have more opportunities and more extensive opportunities to engage in those platforms offline out of school, and therefore, you know, have more opportunities to develop those critical skills. So I would say that that's why it's really important to do it in formal schooling. But I think there's a real, you know, warning signal here. We wouldn't want sessions where we come in and say, right, okay, you know, today we're going to look at Disney and how Disney exploits you and so on. I mean, that's just the wrong way to go about it, in my view. It's much more about talking to children about, you know, where their starting points are, how they are positioned as consumers within a broader market. You know, the household, finances would be a good place to start with young children and how they manage their finances around the household, and then how that moves, you know, outwards and so on. So that's not to say that we shouldn't be doing it in informal spaces. I absolutely think that those informal spaces give you those opportunities that we don't get, especially in England with our very, very narrow curriculum. But that would worry me, that all we're doing really is just solidifying the digital divide.
Hi, Jackie, Phil Benson. The phrase that Rodney used that you didn't hear earlier was turning kids into mini Norman Faircloughs, I think he said. Something like that. But I think that's actually really interesting phrase, because it raised the issue of what critical thinking means for very young children. And whether, because I think our tendency is to think of critical thinking as kind of adult thinking, because, well, we're adults, right, so that's what we know, and we think we know more than young people, so, you know, if they think like us, they'll be critical. So that's the question I'm really interested in, and also, I think it's also sort of the first reaction is to think that whatever the game appears to be teaching, that's what the children are learning. So if the game is teaching people how to kill each other, then kids are learning how to kill each other. But the other point is, I mean, these games have to be transgressive, right? Otherwise nobody will play them, they won't be interesting, because that's where the interest is. And from my personal experience, my son, he played RuneScape, and he did all sorts of awful things. You know, they actually build a zone outside the game, you climb over the fence, and the kids, they can go and kill each other. It's called player killing, PKing, where they can go and fight each other, which is kind of not in the rules of the game, but built into the game as an illegal thing that you can do. But, I mean, all of these things he apparently learned to do, he never did. And he was I guess he was kind of experiencing and learning about these things in a relatively safe environment. And what he learned at the end of the day wasn't bad stuff. I'm not even sure what it was. I mean, I don't even know how I could find out what it was that he was learning. So it's that question, that relationship between what the game seems to be teaching and what the kids are actually learning, I think is a very, very complex and interesting one, where the answer's not obvious. It's not the obvious one.
Mm.
Sorry.
Does Christoph want to answer first, or?
Yeah. I think there's a kind of tendency to make this really simple equation between, you know, you're killing people in virtual worlds or in a video game, therefore you'll go out and, you know, I think when the London riots happened, that got blamed on video games, and there are all sorts of real world violence that gets blamed on video games, and I don't think that, you know, as you suggest, that that's what's going on, you know, at all. So it is a very problematic sort of way of thinking about
that shopping, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. The shopping is good discourse in Moshi Monsters. You know, make yourself and your Moshi Monster happy by going shopping, and they ask you to do it, and you oblige because you feel like you should help them or whatever. Yeah, I didn't ask. Is that what you're taking away from that? You know, a lot of online virtual worlds, I think, do have a really strong role for shopping, and, you know, even Alice's Busu, Alice's Hedgehog. Yeah, I can't say what the kids have been learning from that, but it does throw up opportunities to discuss all of those things with them, I think.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. It's breaking up a bit hard to hear. It's something about shopping and fighting and games like throwing that. Inevitably, you know, games do frame the way in which children encounter various discourses, whether that's violence, shopping, or whatever. What we found, I was involved in a project where we looked at children's engagement in playground games, led by Andrew Byrne at the Institute a couple of years ago. And, you know, we watched children play in the playground, and they were playing out all of those discourses in quite traditional ways. So, you know, playing, fighting, located around World of Warcraft and some of the fighting games, in the same way that they might have done in the 50s around some of the cowboys and Indian films, which were popular in the UK then. Obviously, the difference is subjectivities and where the children are positioned, you know, as fighters in the online games, and what that subjectivity does. In terms of shopping, I have no idea what children are learning about shopping. I'm involved in a project at the moment, but we've not yet collected the data with Rebecca Willett, where we're looking at consumerism in virtual worlds. But I would say that you know, people are always very, very negative about children's consumptive practices in ways that they're not necessarily about their own or adult practices. And there's a book by Alison Pugh called Longing and Belonging, which is worth reading, I think, because she talks about the way in which, you know, these commercial practices are a way of children belonging and constructing that community, however negatively you might view that. Ellen Saiter, you know, talks about popular culture being the lingua franca of playgrounds and so on. So learning those commercial practices is also a way of learning of being within a particular social group and so on, and that's not unproblematic, as we know, because different economic capitals mean different children are able to afford, you know, very different elements within that framework. And then your first question about, you know, whether young children can be critical or what might criticality look like. Again, I would, you know, reference the work of Vivian Vasquez here, who shows clearly that children can ask questions about who made this text, what was their aim in making it, how are they positioning me as the reader, and if I was making this text, you know, what kind of message would I want to be giving to the audience?
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting point. I thought that was an interesting point you made about the shopping, Jackie. Jackie, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, yeah.
I know it's a very, I mean, one thing that kind of struck me as we were having this conversation, and you know, I was listening to Phil and I was listening to Christoph, and I was also kind of listening to my kind of knee-jerk reactions to what each of you were saying is, the idea that video games cause violence is, I think, an idea that most of the people in this room are going to react against quite strongly because they're reacting against this kind of discourse, and that that they would rightly say that, oh, there's no clear evidence of that, where are the studies, blah blah blah. At the same time, we're not particularly reluctant to complain about how it teaches them how to be shoppers. Yeah? So I mean, what I wonder is, what's the difference? If we're ready to dismiss the idea that it's teaching them how to kill people, why aren't we equally dismissive about the idea that it's teaching them consumerism? So I think that's an interesting double standard, but I'm going to be a little bit provocative here in bringing up a kind of position which is not very popular nowadays, but I mean, back when I was saying in university, it was a kind of mainstream, left of center kind of idea. In 1978, in the United States, there was legislation before Congress to ban all advertising to children. To ban all advertising to children. And if it hadn't been for the Iran-Contra, the Iran hostage thing, it probably would have passed. But with the Iran thing, then Carter lost credibility. And but nowadays, in sort of left of center circles and in English departments like this, I don't see anyone saying, oh, let's just ban this kind of thing. That you shouldn't have any advertising on these games for children. It should be against the law. So I suppose my question is there a role for governments in regulating this kind of thing, or have we become libertarian about this?
Yeah.
Sorry. Before you answer that one, because I think it's related, I want to add a comment or a question before relating to this, because you keep saying that, or you both, or actually I myself talking about language learning, that is about the consuming, that the consumerism. Is it just capitalism? Because the children are earning some skill point or some whatever point virtual money, that they are investing their labor in whatever way, like leaving messages, playing games, and chatting to each other, and then you earn one little virtual dollars, and then you learn how to earn money and spend the money. So is it like just consumerism rather than, is it capitalism rather than, because we seem to stress only on the shopping, but they're working really hard.
Okay, does Christoph want to answer first?
I'm good. Maybe you can answer that one, Jackie.
Okay, I think they're both really interesting questions. If I talk about the first one about regulation, in the UK we've had rules around advertising to children on television, not advertising food and so on, and it's basically destroyed the children's television industry because they're no longer able to make programs from the revenues from the advertisements. So whilst we might now have no adverts that portray to children the wonders of McDonald's and so on, they also have fairly poor quality television programming. So, and that certainly is not considered by the people who do lobby against advertising. So my view is, perhaps that we should have some kind of form of self-regulation at the same time as, making sure that children do develop understanding around how they're positioned. There is a lot of research by psychologists on advertising. It's just tireless. And they sort of talk about how children can discern adverts from a very young age and so on, but that's meaningless really in terms of how children understand it and how they use that. So, self-regulation would be somewhere I'd go, just in some ways to try and make sure that there is funding there so that children have good quality programs. Otherwise, they're not watching adverts, but they're also then watching rubbish more or less, I have to say, with some of the repeats that we get. And then the second question, Alice's question on consumerism and capitalism is a good one. They are actually very much positioned in the labour market, Alice. I think that, they've got to earn their coins. Now, some people see this as very positive, so there is a virtual world where children can earn handy coins. If they, help with the household chores, they can earn virtual coins then to spend in the game and so on, which I think is a bit desperate. And whether the children like those games, I have no idea. But I think they're learning a whole range of things. I've not looked into this. I would imagine that, in terms of economics, they're learning quite a lot of things about exchange and so on. And as we know, children are not just consumers but also producers. So, they are able to earn currency themselves. If we look at star dolls, for example, children can produce fashions for some of the avatars that then other children can buy with their virtual coins. And I think as long as children are enjoying that kind of practice and so on, then why shouldn't they be engaging in that kind of commercial activity? Interestingly, though, in the school that I've been looking at virtual worlds for over 7 years now, it really is still just a minority of children who are the producers in these worlds. The majority of consumers of either the producers' markets or other children. So they will buy virtual or take from other children. But rarely are they producers. So again, it's back to that notion to learn the positive aspects of those commercial and capitalist. Well, yes, of course we can. I think I probably might find it challenging to teach children about capitalism from age 3, but I think we can begin those discourses around who makes the money eventually. You might be earning these virtual coins, but it's all going into Disney's pocket in the end. Maybe that's my next challenge. Developing some kind of critical literacy curriculum for 3 and 4 year olds around capitalism. I'll let you know, Alice, if I get there.
Can I just add something? That question about capitalism just reminded me of one of the comments that one of the children made when I asked them, what can people tell about you based on the information that's available to them on your home screen? He said, well, they can see that I'm very good at saving because I have lots of rocks. And so, it was something that he was conscious of and he'd sort of deliberately done, and maybe you could argue that one thing that he's learning is how to save up money or something like that. As a matter of fact, he's quite a good saver in the real world as well.
Hi, Jackie. I want to take back to Machinima and the CPMPs that you presented. It was a great presentation, even though you weren't here in meat space, as they say. So first is a point of clarification. I wanted to know about the CPMV producers, what sort of age group they were for a start off, and I'll tap on my second question on the back of that. Is there a sense in your view that Machinima is, if you like, critical in that it's an act of production and may involve some critique, or is it just a sort of fan discourse that circulates around a virtual world or a game? What's your take on that?
Yeah, in terms of age group, that's a really hard one because you have the information that people present on their YouTube channels, which may be correct or not. And certainly with Kiss on the Wolf, he or she wouldn't, and I actually know their age now because we've had further discussions, but I won't disclose it. But I would say that, from self-disclosure on the YouTube channels, there are children around 11 to 16 generally making the Machinima. That seems to be the age group. In terms of, what function they fulfill is a really interesting one, and I think it could be both. Sometimes it does seem to be largely celebratory, and part of that family ecology that Ito talks about, where really the aim is to impress your peers around your insider geek knowledge of that particular world and that discourse. At other times it's about, actually it's about performance of identities, performance of in-world identities. So they told me that, Chris Honourable told me that there is this server that all the famous penguin avatars go on. So sometimes the machinima are made in there just as a way of, making sure that you're highly visible as a CPPMV celebrity. And at other times, I think it is a more critical, discourse around CP and what it offers and what it doesn't offer. Sort of Foucault's principle of rarity is important, I think, to consider here. Everything's never said, so we've got to look for the absent discourses. And within any discourse of constellation, and it seems to me the absent discourses in that Disney world are very much around power, around childhood, around what it means to be a child and a youth in 21st century. And so some of the CPMVs, you can see are really grappling with some of those issues. The Foot You is a good, Disney Foot You one is a good example of that, but there are many others which rail about particular aspects of the site. So some of it is quite insular. They might not like the way in which this Disney have introduced a particular narrative, or perhaps that big necklace wasn't released in the right week, and so on. Other times it is, more fundamental issues that are at stake here. Generally around Disney is exploiting children's interests. So it really varies across the spectrum, I would say. I don't know if that's, relates to your experience of the Taskmaster machinima and how.
It's a slightly different case because I think that's a much more, in inverted commas, professional orientated thing. So you've got a filmmaker there really who's involved in machinima production, which is unusual. It tends to be more fan-based stuff. But I was just wondering the extent that, criticality can be approached just through production. So there may be sort of some lines to pursue that.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting area. But I would say, in the main, I would say that it's very much about that community of practice, or, as James G talks about, that affinity group, and wanting to position yourself in a particular way within that affinity group in terms of the range of knowledge you have about Club Penguin and so on. And with the CPMV producers who are very successful, it seems to me that a lot of their subsequent productions are much more about maintaining their profile, maintaining their fan base, and like the strategies that I showed on Twitter with Karen Love's Club Penguin. So in that sense, it'd be interesting to trace where the criticality and where the critical issues are. It's one for the future. Thank you.
I had a quick. I was interested in what kind of response Disney. Did Disney actively make responses to comments, or the fuck you Disney thing? Do they kind of respond to that in a defensive way, or do they just let it go? So that's quite interesting. Like, what do they do? So,
they ignore all of that kind of activity. They don't. So, in fact, if people use the Disney products in their machinima, even though there are copyright issues, they ignore all of that. Where they actively pursue people who set up private servers and make sure that they're shut down, because that actually impacts on their revenue. So I think where they feel there is a direct challenge to their revenue, they will, pursue that individual. But in terms of all of the sort of anti-Disney stuff, no, that they ignore all of that. They do make comments on people's Twitter streams where they have got very high profile within the CPMV community. But I would say that's one of their strategies. I outlined those strategies that they use, and I would say that was part of their legitimation strategies. If we can be seen to be on the Twitter stream of this high-profile person, then we might have more legitimacy in their followers' eyes and so on. And certainly there is a lot of that. There's a lot of uncritical acceptance of Disney's role in that. So a lot of the users, one presumes they're children, you know, saying, you know, wow, you just got a comment by Disney and so on. It seemed to sort of valorize that. So no, they're sort of more benign around some of the anti-Disney stuff apart from the CP servers. They haven't persecuted the private server producers in the way that World of Warcraft have, and some of the ones that are sort of targeted at adults. Now, whether that's just because they wouldn't like publicity, you know, you can imagine the headlines, Disney closing down kids' own home-produced stuff and so on. So, you know, it's interesting. They're only really just beginning, I think, to become embedded in children's cultural practices in this way. I mean, I was talking to Disney a couple of years ago about Club Penguin and so on, and you know, they had no idea about some of these activities. And so I think they've, you know, over the last couple of years, this has been a sort of a strategy for them to begin to embed themselves in some of the fan practices surrounding that. So whether they've had time to think through, you know, those issues, I don't know. And also I think there is a change in the music industry. In the early days of CPMV, a lot of them were taken down by the labels because of copyright issues. Now they're more likely to link through to iTunes and Amazon and see it as a revenue source. So, you know, it's an interesting space, I think, to look at how Disney are responding to all of that. I think my voice is going, but we'll see if it hangs on.
That's great, thank you. Any further questions? Or conscious of your voice, I think we should probably stop asking you more questions. But if no one has any other questions, we could sort of wrap it up. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Okay, hope it goes well. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Came all the way there to ask
So it's interesting what you just said about
So we have,
So yeah, we have coffee.
we have coffee again, coffee and snacks.
the worst example of consumer.
Yeah, maybe. I think they all have their
No, I think that's what we're doing.
yeah.
I think extremely